Pythias. Pytheas of Massalia, /Pytheas / Ancient Greek, pi upsilon theta alpha sigma mu alpha sigma alpha lambda iota tau eta sigma Pythias Massaliōtēs, Latin, Pythias Massiliensis, FL. 4th century BC, was a Greek geographer and explorer from the Greek colony of Massalia, modern-day Marseille, France. He made a voyage of exploration to northwestern Europe in about 325 BC, but his account of it, known widely in Antiquity, has not survived and is now known only through the writings of others. On this voyage, he circumnavigated and visited a considerable part of modern-day Great Britain and Ireland. He was the first known scientific visitor to see and describe the Arctic, polar ice, and the Celtic and Germanic tribes. He is also the first person on record to describe the midnight sun. The theoretical existence of some northern phenomena that he described, such as a frigid zone, and temperate zones where the nights are very short in summer and the sun does not set at the summer solstice, was already known. Similarly, reports of a country of perpetual snow and darkness, the country of the Hyperboreans, had reached the Mediterranean some centuries before. Pythias introduced the idea of distant Thule to the geographic imagination, and his account of the tides is the earliest one known that suggests the moon as their cause. He also may have reached Iceland. Dates. Pliny says that Timaeus, born about 350 BC, believed Pythias' story of the discovery of amber. 1st century BC Strabo says that Dicaeurchus, died about 285 BC, did not trust the stories of Pythias. That is all the information that survives concerning the date of Pythias' voyage. Presuming that Timaeus would not have written until after he was 20 years old in about 330 BC and Dicaeurchus would have needed time to write his most mature work, after 300 BC, there is no reason not to accept Henry Fanshawe Tozer's interval of 330 to 300 BC for the voyage. Some would give Timaeus an extra 5 years, bringing the voyage to 325 BC at earliest. There is no further evidence. If one presumes that Pythias would not have written before reaching age 20, he would have been a contemporary and competitor of Timaeus and Dicaeurchus. As they read his writings, he must have written toward the earlier years of the interval. Record. Pythias described his travels in a work that has not survived, only excerpts remain, quoted or paraphrased by later authors, most familiarly in Strabo's Geographica, Pliny's Natural History and passages in Diodorus of Sicily's History. Most of the ancients, including the first two just mentioned, referred to his work by his name. Pythias says, 2 late writers give titles. The astronomical author Geminus of Rhodes mentions tau pi epsilon rho tau omicron kappa epsilon alpha nu omicron, tau piri to okinu, literally things about the ocean, sometimes translated as description of the ocean, on the ocean or ocean. Marcianus, the scholiast Apollonius of Rhodes, mentions pi epsilon rho omicron delta omicron sigma gamma sigma, periodos ges, a trip around the Earth, or pi epsilon rho pi lambda omicron upsilon sigma, periplus, sail around. Scholars of the 19th century tended to interpret these titles as the names of distinct works covering separate voyages. For example, Smith's Dictionary of Greek and Roman Biography and Mythology hypothesizes a voyage to Britain and Thule written about in ocean, and another from Cadiz to the Don River, written about in sail around. As is common with ancient texts, multiple titles may represent a single source, for example, if a title refers to a section rather than the whole. Presently, periplus is recognized as a genre of navigational literature. Mainstream consensus is that there was only one work, On the Ocean, which was based on a periplus. Diodorus does not mention Pythias by name. The association is made as follows. Pliny reports that Timaeus says there is an island named Myctus, where tin is found, and to which the Britons cross. Diodorus says that tin is brought to the island of Ictus, where there is an emporium. The last link is supplied by Strabo, who says that an emporium on the island of Corbulo in the mouth of the river Loire was associated with the Britain of Pythias by Polybius. Assuming that Ictus, Myctus and Corbulo are the same, Diodorus appears to have read Timaeus, who must have read Pythias, whom Polybius also read. Circumstances of the voyage. Pythias was the first documented Mediterranean mariner to reach the British Isles. The start of Pythias's voyage is unknown. The Carthaginians had closed the Strait of Gibraltar to all ships from other nations. Some historians, mainly of the late 19th century and before, therefore speculated, without any evidence, that he must have traveled overland to the mouth of the Loire or the Garonne. Others believed that, to avoid the Carthaginian blockade, He may have stayed close to land and sailed only at night, or taken advantage of a temporary lapse in the blockade. An alternate theory is that by the 4th century BC, the Western Greeks, especially the Massaliotes, were on amicable terms with Carthage. In 348 BC, Carthage and Rome came to terms over the Sicilian Wars with a treaty defining their mutual interests. Rome could use Sicilian markets, Carthage could buy and sell goods at Rome, and slaves taken by Carthage from allies of Rome were to be set free. Rome was to stay out of the western Mediterranean, but these terms did not apply to Massalia, which had its own treaty. During the second half of the 4th century BC, the time of Pythias' voyage, Massaliotes were presumably free to operate as they pleased. There is, at least, no evidence of conflict with Carthage in any of the sources that mention the voyage. The early part of Pythias' voyage is outlined by statements of Eratosthenes that Strabo says are false because taken from Pythias. Apparently, Pythias said that tides ended at the sacred promontory, Ieranakriterion, or Sagres Point, and from there to Goddess is said to be 5 days' sail. Strabo complains about this distance, and about Pythias' portrayal of the exact location of Tartessos. Mention of these places in a journal of the voyage indicates that Pythias passed through the Straits of Gibraltar and sailed north along the coast of Portugal. Voyage to Britain. The Circumnavigation. Strabo reports that Pythias says he traveled over the whole of Britain that was accessible. The word apeltine, at root come upon, does not imply any specific method, and Pythias does not elaborate. He does use the word hull and he states a perimeter, of more than 40,000 stadia. Using Herodotus' standard of 600 feet, 180 meters, for one stadium gives 4,545 miles, 7,314 kilometers. However, there is no way to tell which standard foot was in effect. The English foot is an approximation. Strabo wants to discredit Pythias on the grounds that 40,000 stadia is outrageously high and cannot be real. Diodorus Siculus gives a similar number, 42,500 stadia, about 4,830 miles, 7,770 kilometers, and explains that it is the perimeter of a triangle around Britain. The consensus has been that he probably took his information from Pythias through Timaeus. Pliny gives the circuitous reported by Pythias as 4,875 Roman miles. The explorer Fridtjof Nansen explains this apparent fantasy of Pythias as a mistake of Timaeus. Strabo and Diodorus Siculus never saw Pythias' work, says Nansen, but they and others read of him in Timaeus. Pythias reported only days' sail. Timaeus converted days to stadia at the rate of 1,000 per day, a standard figure of the times. However, Pythias only sailed 560 stadia per day for a total of 23,800, which in Nansen's view is consistent with 700 stadia per degree. Nansen later states that Pythias must have stopped to obtain astronomical data. Presumably, the extra time was spent ashore. Using the stadia of Diodorus Siculus, one obtains 42.5 days for the time that would be spent in circumnavigating Britain. It may have been a virtual circumnavigation, see under Thule below. The perimeter, according to Nansen based on the 23,800 stadia, was 2,375 miles, 3,822 kilometers. This number is in the neighborhood of what a triangular perimeter ought to be, but it cannot be verified against anything Pythias may have said, nor is Diodorus Siculus very precise about the locations of the legs. The perimeter is often translated as coastline, but this translation is misleading. The coastline, following all the bays and inlets, is 7,723 miles, 12,429 kilometers, see Geography of the United Kingdom. Pythias could have traveled any perimeter between that number and Diodorus. Polybius adds that Pythias said he traversed the whole of Britain on foot, of which he, Polybius, is skeptical. Despite Strabo's conviction of a lie, the perimeter said to have been given by Pythias is not evidence of it. The issue of what he did say can never be settled until more fragments of Pythias literature are found. Name and description of the British. The first known written use of the word Britain was an ancient Greek transliteration of the original Celtic term. It is believed to have appeared within a periplus by the geographer and explorer Pytheas of Massalia, but no copies of this work survive. The earliest existing records of the word are quotations of the periplus by later authors, such as those within Strabo's Geographica, Pliny's Natural History and Diodorus of Sicily's Bibliotheca Historica. According to Strabo, Pythias referred to Britain as Bretonique, which is treated a feminine noun. Britain is most like Welsh in Ysbrydain, the island of Britain, in which is a P-Celtic allophone of Q-Celtic Cruinia in Irish Cruth and Tua, land of the Picts. The base word is Scottish/Irish Cruth, Welsh pride, meaning form. The British were the people of forms, with a sense of shapes or pictures, thought to refer to their practice of tattooing or war painting. The Roman word Picti, the Picts, means painted. This etymology shows that Pythias interacted not so much with Irish or Scots, as they used Q-Celtic. Rather, Pythias brought back the P-Celtic form from more geographically accessible regions where Welsh or Breton are spoken presently. Furthermore, some Proto-Celtic was spoken over all of Greater Britain, and this particular spelling is prototypical of those more populous regions. Diodorus, based on Pythias, reports that Britain is cold and subject to frosts, being too much subject to the bear, and not under the Arctic pole, as some translations say. The numerous population of natives, he says, live in thatched cottages, store their grain in subterranean caches and bake bread from it. They are of simple manners, ʻpɪθiəs and hapless, and are content with plain fare. They are ruled by many kings and princes who live in peace with each other. Their troops fight from chariots, as did the Greeks in the Trojan War. The three corners of Britain, Contione, Illyrian and Orcas. Opposite Europe and Diodorus is the promontory, Acriterion, of Contione, Kent, 100 stadia, about 11 miles, 18 kilometers, from the land, but the text is ambiguous. The land could be either Britain or the continent. 4 days' sail beyond that is another promontory, Illyrian, which can only be Cornwall, as Diodorus is describing the triangular perimeter, and the third point is Orcas, presumably the main island of the Orkney Islands. The tin trade. The inhabitants of Cornwall are involved in the manufacture of tin ingots. They mine the ore, smelt it and then work it into pieces the shape of knuckle bones, after which it is transported to the island of Ichthys by wagon, which can be done at low tide. Merchants purchasing it there pack it on horses for 30 days to the River Rhone, where it is carried down to the mouth. Diodorus says that the inhabitants of Cornwall are civilized in manner and especially hospitable to strangers because of their dealings with foreign merchants. Discovery of Thule. Strabo relates, taking his text from Polybius, Pythias asserts that he explored in person the whole northern region of Europe as far as the ends of the world. Strabo does not believe it, but he explains what Pythias means by the ends of the world. Though, he says, now spelled Thule, Pliny the Elder uses Tile, Virgil references Ultima Thule in Georgicae, line 30, where the Ultima refer to the end of the world, is the most northerly of the British Isles. There the circle of the summer tropic is the same as the Arctic Circle, see below on Arctic Circle. Moreover, says Strabo, none of the other authors mention Thule, a fact which he uses to discredit Pythias, but which to moderns indicates Pythias was the first explorer to arrive there and tell of it. Thule is described as an island 6 days sailing north of Britain, near the frozen sea, Papagaia thalata, solidified sea. Pliny adds that it has no nights at midsummer when the sun is passing through the sign of the crab, at the summer solstice, a reaffirmation that it is on the Arctic Circle. He adds that the crossing to Thule starts at the island of Baris, the largest of all, which may be Lewis in the Outer Hebrides. If Baris was in the Outer Hebrides, the crossing would have brought Pythias to the coast of Morag Romsdal or Trøndelag, Norway, explaining how he managed to miss the Skagerrak. If this is his route, in all likelihood he did not actually circumnavigate Britain, but returned along the coast of Germany, accounting for his somewhat larger perimeter. Concerning the location of Thule, a discrepancy in data caused subsequent geographers some problems, and may be responsible for Ptolemy's distortion of Scotland. Strabo reports that Eratosthenes places Thule at a parallel 11,500 stadia, 1,305 miles, or 16.4 degrees, north of the mouth of the Borysthenes. The parallel running through that mouth also passes through Celtica and is Pythias baseline. Using 3,700 or 3,800 stadia, approximately 420 to 430 miles or 5.3 degrees minus 5.4 degrees, north of Marseille for a baseline obtains a latitude of 64.8 degrees or 64.9 degrees for Thule, well short of the Arctic Circle. It is in fact the latitude of Trondheim, where Pythias may have made land. A statement by Geminus of Rhodes quotes on the ocean as saying, Nansen claimed that according to this statement, Pythias was there in person and that the 21 and 22-hour days must be the customary statement of latitude by length of longest day. He calculates the latitudes to be 64 degrees 32 and 65 degrees 31, partially confirming Hipparchus' statement of the latitude of Thule. And yet Strabo says, Eratosthenes extends the latitudinal distance from Massalia to Celtica to 5,000 stadia, 7.1 degrees, placing the baseline in Normandy. The northernmost location cited in Britain at the Firth of Clyde is now northern Scotland. To get this country south of Britain to conform to Strabo's interpretation of Pythias, Ptolemy has to rotate Scotland by 90 degrees. The 5,000 stadia must be discounted. It crosses the Borysthenes upriver near Kiev rather than at the mouth. It does place Pythias on the Arctic Circle, which in Norway is south of the Lofoten Islands. It seems that Eratosthenes altered the baseline to pass through the northern extreme of Celtica. Pythias, as related by Hipparchus, probably cited the place in Celtica where he first made land. If he used the same practice in Norway, Thule is at least somewhere on the entire northwest coast of Norway from Møre-og-Romsdal to the Lofoten Islands. The explorer, Richard Francis Burton, in his study of Thule states that it has had many definitions over the centuries. Many more authors have written about it than remembered Pythias. The question of the location of Pythias Thule remains. The latitudes given by the ancient authors can be reconciled. The missing datum required to fix the location is longitude. Manifestly we cannot rely upon the longitude. Pythias crossed the waters northward from Barras, in the north of the British Isles, but whether to starboard, larboard, or straight ahead is not known. From the time of the Roman Empire all the possibilities were suggested repeatedly by each generation of writers: Iceland, Shetland, the Faroe Islands, Norway and later Greenland. A manuscript variant of a name in Pliny has abetted the Iceland theory, near Igon instead of Barras, which sounds like Norway. If one sails west from Norway one encounters Iceland. Burton himself has passed this theory. The standard texts have Barras presently, as well as Burgos for Vergos in the same list of islands. The Scandii Islands are more of a problem, as they could be Scandinavia, but other islands had that name as well. Moreover, Procopius says, Tabello Gothico, chapter 15, that the earlier name of Scandinavia was Thule and that it was the home of the Goths. The fact that Pythias returned from the vicinity of the Baltic favors Procopius's opinion. The fact that Pythias lived centuries before the colonization of Iceland and Greenland by European agriculturalists makes them less likely candidates, as he stated that Thule was populated and its soil was tilled. Concerning the people of Thule Strabo says of Pythias, but grudgingly. What he seems to be describing is an agricultural country that uses barns for threshing grain rather than the Mediterranean outside floor of sun-baked mud and manufactures a drink, possibly mead. Encounter with drift ice. After mentioning the crossing, navigatio, from Barras to Tidal, Pliny makes a brief statement that the mare concretum appears to match Strabo's Pepigaiathalata and is probably the same as the topoi, places, mentioned in Strabo's apparent description of spring drift ice, which would have stopped his voyage further north and was for him the ultimate limit of the world. Strabo says, the term used for marine lung, Plumen thiladios, appears to refer to jellyfish of the type the ancients called sea lung. The latter are mentioned by Aristotle and on the parts of animals as being free-floating and insensate. They are not further identifiable from what Aristotle says, but some pulmones appear in Pliny as a class of insensate sea animal, specifically the haloplumen, saltwater lung. William Ogle, a major translator and annotator of Aristotle, attributes the name sea lung to the lung-like expansion and contraction of the medusae, a kind of cnidaria, during locomotion. The ice resembled floating circles in the water. The modern English term for this phenomenon is pancake ice. The association of Pythias observations with drift ice has long been standard in navigational literature, including Nathaniel Bowditch's American Practical Navigator, which begins chapter 33, Ice Navigation, with Pythias. At its edge, sea, slush, and ice mix, surrounded by fog. Discovery of the Baltic. Strabo says that Pythias gave an account of what is beyond the Rhine as far as Scythia, which he, Strabo, thinks is false. In the geographers of the late Roman Republic and early Roman Empire, such as Ptolemy, Scythia stretches eastward from the mouth of the river Vistula, thus Pythias must have described the Germanic coast of the Baltic Sea. If the statement is true, there are no other possibilities. As to whether he explored it in person, he said that he explored the entire north in person, see under Thule above. As the periplus was a sort of ship's log, he probably did reach the Vistula. According to the Natural History by Pliny the Elder, The Gutones is a simplification of two manuscript variants, Gutonibus and Gionibus, which would be in the nominative case Gutones or Giones, the Goths in the main opinion. The second major manuscript variant is either Mentonomon, nominative case, or Metuonides, genitive case. A number of etymologies have been proposed but none very well accepted. Amber is not actually named. It is termed the Concretimaris pergamentum, the frozen sea's leavings after the springtime melt. Diodorus uses electron, the Greek word for amber, the object that gave its name to electricity through its ability to acquire a charge. Pliny is presenting an archaic opinion, as in his time amber was a precious stone brought from the Baltic at great expense, but the Germans, he says, use it for firewood, according to Pythias. Mentonomon is unambiguously stated to be an estuarium or estuary of 6,000 stadia, which using the Herodotean standard of 600 feet, 180 meters, per stadium is 681 miles, 1,096 kilometers. That number happens to be the distance from the mouth of the Skayurog to the mouth of the Vistula, but no source says explicitly where the figure was taken. Competing views, however, usually have to reinterpret estuary to mean something other than an estuary, as the west of the Baltic Sea is the only body of estuarial water of sufficient length in the region. Earlier Pliny says that a large island of 3 days' sail from the Scythian coast called Belcia by Xenophon of Lampsacus is called Massalia by Pythias. It is generally understood to be the same as Abalis. Based on the amber, the island could have been Heligoland, Zealand, the shores of Bay of Gdansk, Sambia or the Curonian Lagoon, which were historically the richest sources of amber in northern Europe. This is the earliest use of Germania. Voyage to the Don. Pythias claimed to have explored the entire north, however, he turned back at the mouth of the Vistula, the border with Scythia. If he had gone on he would have discovered the ancestral Balts. They occupied the lands to the east of the Vistula. In the west they began with the people living around Frisia's half, Lithuanian Asmares, Sea of the Ascians, who in that vicinity became the Baltic Prussians. On the east Herodotus called them the Nuri, a name related to Old Prussian Naris, the deep, in the sense of water country. Later Lithuanians would be the people of the shore. The Vistula was the traditional limit of Greater Germany. Place names featuring Narr are wide ranging over the vast Proto-Baltic homeland, occupying western Russia before the Slavs. Herodotus says that the Nuri had Scythian customs, but they were at first not considered Scythian. During the war between the Scythians and the Persian Empire, the Scythians came to dominate the Nuri. Strabo denies that any knowledge of the shores of the eastern Baltic existed. He had heard of the Sauromatai, but had no idea where to place them. Herodotus had mentioned these Sauromatai as a distinct people living near the Nuri. Pliny the Elder, however, is much better informed. The island of Bononia, Bornholm, he says lies a day's sail off Scythia, where amber is collected. To him the limit of Germany is the Vistula. In contrast to Strabo, he knows that the Goths live around the Vistula, but these are definitely Germans. By the time of Tacitus, the Estai have emerged. The former Scythia is now entirely Sarmatia. Evidently the Sarmatians have conquered westward to the Vistula. The Goths have moved to the south. That the Balts lived east of the Vistula from remote prehistoric times is unquestioned. The Baltic languages, however, are only known from the 2nd millennium AD. They are known to have developed in tribal contexts, as they were originally tribal. The first mention of any tribes is in Ptolemy's description of European Sarmatia, where the main Prussian tribes are mentioned for the first time. In Tacitus, only the language of the Estai is mentioned. Strabo distinguishes the Veneti, who were likely Slavs. From these few references, which are the only surviving evidence apart from glottochronology and place name analysis, it would seem that the Balts of Pythias' time were well past the common Balto-Slavic stage, and likely spoke a number of related dialects. By turning back at what he thought was the limit of Germany, he not only missed the Balts, but did not discover that more Germans, the Goths, had moved into the Baltic area. Polybius relates, on his return thence, from the north, he traversed the whole of the coast of Europe from Gades to the Tanais. Some authors consider this leg a second voyage, as it does not seem likely he would pass by Marseille without refitting and refreshing the crew. It is striking that he encountered the border of Scythia, turned around, and went around Europe counterclockwise until he came to the southern side of Scythia on the Black Sea. It is possible to speculate that he may have hoped to circumnavigate Europe, but the sources do not say. In other, even more speculative interpretations, Pythias returned north and the Tanais is not the Don but is a northern river, such as the Elbe River. Measurements of latitude. Latitude by the altitude of the Sun. In discussing the work of Pythias, Strabo typically uses direct discourse. Pythias says, in presenting his astronomical observations, he changes to indirect discourse. Hipparchus says that Pythias says, either because he never read Pythias' manuscript, because it was not available to him, or in deference to Hipparchus, who appears to have been the first to apply the Babylonian system of representing the sphere of the Earth by 360 degrees. Strabo uses the degrees, based on Hipparchus. Neither say that Pythias did. Nevertheless, Pythias did obtain latitudes, which, according to Strabo, he expressed in proportions of the gnomon, index, or trigonometric tangents of angles of elevation to celestial bodies. They were measured on the gnomon, the vertical leg of a right triangle, and the flat leg of the triangle. The imaginary hypotenuse looked along the line of sight to the celestial body or marked the edge of the shadow cast by the vertical leg on the horizontal leg. Pythias took the altitude of the Sun at Massalia at noon on the longest day of the year and found that the tangent was the proportion of 120, the length of the gnomon, to 1/5 less than 42, the length of the shadow. Hipparchus, relying on the authority of Pythias, says Strabo, states that the ratio is the same as for Byzantium and that the two therefore are on the same parallel. Nansen and others prefer to give the cotangent 209/600, which is the inverse of the tangent, but the angle is greater than 45 degrees and it is the tangent that Strabo states. His number system did not permit him to express it as a decimal, but the tangent is about 2.87. It is unlikely that any of the geographers could compute the arctangent, or angle of that tangent. Moderns look it up in a table. Hipparchus is said to have had a table of some angles. The altitude, or angle of elevation, is 70 degrees 47/50 inches, but that is not the latitude. At noon on the longest day, the plane of longitude passing through Marseille is exactly on edge to the Sun. If the Earth's axis were not tilted toward the Sun, a vertical rod at the equator would have no shadow. A rod further north would have a north-south shadow, and as an elevation of 90 degrees would be a zero latitude. The complement of the elevation gives the latitude. The Sun is even higher in the sky due to the tilt. The angle added to the elevation by the tilt is known as the obliquity of the ecliptic, and at that time was 23 degrees 44/40 inches. The complement of the elevation less the obliquity is 43 degrees 13, only 5 in error from Marseille's latitude, 43 degrees 18. Latitude by the elevation of the North Pole. A second method of determining the latitude of the observer measures the angle of elevation of a celestial pole, north in the northern hemisphere. Seen from 0 latitude, the North Pole's elevation is 0, that is, it is a point on the horizon. The declination of the observer's zenith also is 0, and therefore so is their latitude. As the observer's latitude increases, traveling north, so does the declination. The pole rises over the horizon by an angle of the same amount. The elevation at the terrestrial North Pole is 90 degrees, straight up, and the celestial pole has a declination of the same value. The latitude also is 90. Moderns have Polaris to mark the approximate location of the North Celestial Pole, which it does nearly exactly, but this position of Polaris was not available in Pythias' time, due to changes in the positions of the stars. Pythias reported that the pole was an empty space at the corner of a quadrangle, the other 3 sides of which were marked by stars. Their identity has not survived, but based on calculations these are believed to have been Alpha and Kappa in Draco and Beta in Ursa Minor. Pythias sailed northward with the intent of locating the Arctic Circle and exploring the frigid zone to the north of it at the extreme of the Earth. He did not know the latitude of the circle in degrees. All he had to go by was the definition of the frigid zone as the latitudes north of the line where the celestial Arctic Circle was equal to the celestial Tropic of Cancer, the Tropicos Kuklos, refer to the next subsection. Strabo's angular report of this line as being at 24 degrees may well be based on a tangent known to Pythias, but he does not say that. In whatever mathematical form Pythias knew the location, he could only have determined when he was there by taking periodic readings of the elevation of the pole, ex Armatopoulou and Strabo and others. Today the elevation can be obtained easily on ship with a quadrant. Electronic navigational systems have made even this simple measure unnecessary. Longitude was beyond Pythias and his peers, but it was not of as great a consequence, because ships seldom strayed out of sight of land. East-west distance was a matter of contention to the geographers. They are one of Strabo's most frequent topics. Because of the gnomon, north-south distances were accurate often to within a degree. It is unlikely that any gnomon could be read accurately on the pitching deck of a small vessel at night. Pythias must have made frequent overnight stops to use his gnomon and talk to the natives, which would have required interpreters, probably acquired along the way. The few fragments that have survived indicate that this material was a significant part of the periplus, possibly kept as the ship's log. There is little hint of native hostility. The Celts and the Germans appear to have helped him, which suggests that the expedition was put forward as purely scientific. In any case, all voyages required stops for food, water and repairs. The treatment of voyagers fell under the special guest ethic for visitors. Location of the Arctic Circle. The ancient Greek view of the heavenly bodies on which their navigation was based was imported from Babylonia by the Ionian Greeks, who used it to become a seafaring nation of merchants and colonists during the Archaic period in Greece. Massalia was an Ionian colony. The first Ionian philosopher, Thales, was known for his ability to measure the distance of a ship at sea from a cliff by the very method Pythias used to determine the latitude of Massalia, the trigonometric ratios. The astronomic model on which ancient Greek navigation was based, which is still in place today, was already extant in the time of Pythias, the concept of the degrees only being missing. The model divided the universe into a celestial and an earthly sphere pierced by the same poles. Each of the spheres were divided into zones, zonai, by circles, kukoi, in planes at right angles to the poles. The zones of the celestial sphere repeated on a larger scale those of the terrestrial sphere. The basis for division into zones was the two distinct paths of the heavenly bodies, that of the stars and that of the sun and moon. Astronomers know today that the Earth revolving around the sun is tilted on its axis, bringing each hemisphere now closer to the sun, now further away. The Greeks had the opposite model, that the stars and the sun rotated around the Earth. The stars moved in fixed circles around the poles. The sun moved at an oblique angle to the circles, which obliquity brought it now to the north, now to the south. The circle of the sun was the ecliptic. It was the center of a band called the zodiac on which various constellations were located. The shadow cast by a vertical rod at noon was the basis for defining zonation. The intersection of the northernmost or southernmost points of the ecliptic defined the axial circles passing through those points as the two tropics, tropikoi kukoi, circles at the turning points, later named for the zodiacal constellations found there, Cancer and Capricorn. During noon of the summer solstice, the trope, rods there cast no shadow. The latitudes between the tropics were called the torrid zone, Diakakaumani, burned up. Based on their experience of the torrid zone south of Egypt and Libya, the Greek geographers judged it uninhabitable. Symmetry requires that there be an uninhabitable frigid zone, Cape Sigmani, frozen, to the north, and reports from there since the time of Homer seem to confirm it. The edge of the frigid zone ought to be as far south from the North Pole in latitude as the summer tropic is from the equator. Strabo gives it as 24 degrees, which may be based on a previous tangent of Pythias, but he does not say. The Arctic Circle would then be at 66 degrees, accurate to within a degree. Seen from the equator, the celestial North Pole, Boreos Polos, is a point on the horizon. As the observer moves northward, the pole rises and the circumpolar stars appear, now unblocked by the Earth. At the Tropic of Cancer, the radius of the circumpolar stars reaches 24 degrees. The edge stands on the horizon. The constellation of Micra-Arctus, Ursa Minor, Little Bear, was entirely contained within the circumpolar region. The latitude was therefore called the Arcticos Kuklos, Circle of the Bear. The terrestrial Arctic Circle was regarded as fixed at this latitude. The celestial Arctic Circle was regarded as identical to the circumference of the circumpolar stars and therefore a variable. When the observer is on the terrestrial Arctic Circle and the radius of the circumpolar stars is 66 degrees, the celestial Arctic Circle is identical to the celestial Tropic of Cancer. That is what Pythias means when he says that Thule is located at the place where the Arctic Circle is identical to the Tropic of Cancer. At that point, on the day of the summer solstice, the vertical rod of the gnomon casts a shadow extending in theory to the horizon over 360 degrees as the sun does not set. Under the pole, the Arctic Circle is identical to the equator and the sun never sets but rises and falls on the horizon. The shadow of the gnomon winds perpetually around it. Latitude by length of longest day, and by sun's elevation on shortest day. Strabo uses the astronomical cubit, ppēkas, the length of the forearm from the elbow to the tip of the little finger, as a measure of the elevation of the sun. The term cubit in this context is obscure. It has nothing to do with distance along either a straight line or an arc, does not apply to celestial distances, and has nothing to do with the gnomon. Hipparchus borrowed this term from Babylonia, where it meant 2 degrees. They in turn took it from ancient Sumer so long ago that if the connection between cubits and degrees was known in either Babylonia or Ionia, it did not survive. Strabo states degrees in either cubits or as a proportion of a great circle. The Greeks also used the length of day at the summer solstice as a measure of latitude. It is stated in equinoctial hours, horai e samarinai, one being 1/12 of the time between sunrise and sunset on an equinox. Based partly on data taken from Pythias, Hipparchus correlated cubits of the sun's elevation at noon on the winter solstice, latitudes in hours of a day on the summer solstice, and distances between latitudes and stadia for some locations. Pythias had proved that Marseille and Byzantium were on the same parallel, see above. Hipparchus, through Strabo, adds that Byzantium and the mouth of the Borysthenes, today's Dnieper River, were on the same meridian and were separated by 3,700 stadia, 5.3 degrees at Strabo's 700 stadia per a degree of meridian arc. As the parallel through the river mouth also crossed the coast of Celtica, the distance due north from Marseille to Celtica was 3,700 stadia, a baseline from which Pythias seems to have calculated latitude and distance. Strabo says that Iarn, written Ronu Ada, meaning Ireland, is under 5,000 stadia, 7.1 degrees, north of this line. These figures place Celtica around the mouth of the Loire River, an emporium for the trading of British tin. The part of Ireland referenced is the vicinity of Belfast. Pythias then would either have crossed the Bay of Biscay from the coast of Spain to the mouth of the Loire, or reached it along the coast, crossed the English Channel from the vicinity of Brest, France to Cornwall, and traversed the Irish Sea to reach the Orkney Islands. A statement of Eratosthenes attributed by Strabo to Pythias, that the north of the Iberian Peninsula was an easier passage to Celtica than across the ocean, is somewhat ambiguous. Apparently he knew of both routes, but he does not say which he took. At noon on the winter solstice the sun stands at 9 cubits and the longest day on the summer solstice is 16 hours at the baseline through Celtica. At 2,500 stadia, approximately 283 miles, or 3.6 degrees, north of Celtica, are a people Hipparchus called Celtic, but whom Strabo thinks are the British, a discrepancy he might not have noted if he had known that the British were also Celtic. The location is Cornwall. The sun stands at 6 cubits and the longest day is 17 hours. At 9,100 stadia, approximately 1,032 miles, north of Marseille, 5,400 or 7.7 degrees north of Celtica, the elevation is 4 cubits and the longest day is 18 hours. This location is in the vicinity of the Firth of Clyde. Here Strabo launches another quibble. Hipparchus, relying on Pythias, according to Strabo, places this area south of Britain, but he, Strabo, calculates that it is north of Ireland, Iarn/Ronuada. Pythias, however, rightly knows what is now Scotland as part of Britain, land of the Picts, even though north of Ireland/Iarn. North of southern Scotland the longest day is 19 hours. Strabo, based on theory alone, states that Iarn is so cold that any lands north of it must be uninhabited. In the hindsight given to moderns, Pythias, in relying on observation in the field, appears more scientific than Strabo, who discounted the findings of others merely because of their strangeness to him. The ultimate cause of his skepticism is simply that he did not believe Scandinavia could exist. This disbelief may also be the cause of alteration of Pythias' data. On the tides, Pliny reports that Pytheas of Massalia informs us that in Britain the tide rises 80 cubits. The passage does not give enough information to determine which cubit Pliny meant, however, any cubit gives the same general result. If he was reading an early source, the cubit may have been the Cyrenaic cubit, an early Greek cubit, of 463.1 millimeters, in which case the distance was 37 meters, 121 feet. This number far exceeds any modern known tides. The National Oceanography Centre, which records tides at tidal gauges placed in about 55 ports of the UK tide gauge network on an ongoing basis, records the highest mean tidal change between 1987 and 2007 at Avonmouth in the Severn estuary of 6.955 meters, 22.82 feet. The highest predicted spring tide between 2008 and 2026 at that location will be 14.64 meters, 48.0 feet, on September 29, 2015. Even allowing for geologic and climate change, Pythias' 80 cubits far exceeds any known tides around Britain. One well-circulated but unevidenced answer to the paradox is that Pythias is referring to a storm surge. Despite the modern arguments, the fact remains that Pythias experienced tides that exceeded by far the usual tides in the Mediterranean, and particularly those at Massilia. Matching fragments of Aetius and Pseudo-Plutarch and Stabaeus attribute the flood tides, pi lambda mu mu upsilon rho alpha iota plem uri, to the filling of the moon, pi lambda rho omega sigma iota sigma tau sigma sigma epsilon lambda nu eta sigma pleurosis des Salienses, and the ebb tides, mu pi tau iota delta epsilon sigma ebb tides, to the lessening, mu epsilon omega sigma iota sigma meiosis. The words are too ambiguous to make an exact determination of Pythias' meaning, whether diurnal or spring and neap tides are meant, or whether full and new moons or the half cycles in which they occur. Different translators take different views. That daily tide should be caused by full moons and new moons is manifestly wrong, which would be a surprising view in a Greek astronomer and mathematician of the times. He could have meant that spring and neap tides were caused by new and full moons, which is partially correct in that spring tides occur at those times. A gravitational theory, objects fall to the center, existed at the time, but Pythias appears to have meant that the phases themselves were the causes, alpha tau alpha iota adi. However imperfect or imperfectly related the viewpoint, Pythias was the first to associate the tides to the phases of the moon. Literary influence. Pythias was a central source of information on the North Sea and the subarctic regions of Western Europe to later periods, and possibly the only source. The only ancient authors we know by name who certainly saw Pythias' original text were Dicaearchus, Timaeus, Eratosthenes, Crates of Malice, Hipparchus, Polybius, Artemidorus, and Posidonius. Notably, the list does not include Strabo or Tacitus, though Strabo discusses him and Tacitus may likely have known about his work. Either of the two could have known him through other writers or have read his work in the original. Strabo, citing Polybius, accuses Pythias of promulgating a fictitious journey he could never have funded, as he was a private individual, idiots, and a poor man. Penis. Markham proposes a possible answer to the funding question, seeing that Pythias was known as a professional geographer and that North Europe was as yet a question mark to Massalian merchants. He suggests that the enterprise was a government expedition of which Pythias was placed in command. In another suggestion, the merchants of Marseille sent him out to find northern markets. These theories are speculative, but perhaps less so than Strabo's contention that Pythias was a charlatan just because a professional geographer doubted him. Strabo does explain his reasons for doubting Pythias' veracity. Citing numerous instances of Pythias apparently being far off the mark on details concerning known regions, he says, however, any man who has told such great falsehoods about the known regions would hardly, I imagine, be able to tell the truth about places that are not known to anybody. As an example, he mentions that Pythias says Kent is several days' sail from Celtica when it is visible from Gaul across the Channel. If Pythias had visited the place, he should have verified it personally. The objection, although partially true, is itself flawed. Strabo interjects his own view of the location of Celtica, that it was opposite to Britain, end to end. Pythias, however, places it further south, around the mouth of the Loire, see above, from which it might justifiably be several days' sail. The people across from Britain in Caesar's time are the Germani in the north and the Belgi in the south. Still, some of the Celtic lands were on the Channel and were visible from it, which Pythias should have mentioned, but Strabo implies he did not. Strabo's other objections are similarly flawed or else completely wrong. He simply did not believe the earth was inhabited north of Earn. Pythias, however, could not then answer for himself, or protect his own work from loss or alteration, so most of the questions concerning his voyage remain unresolved, to be worked over by every generation. To some he is a daring adventurer and discoverer, to others, a semi-legendary blunderer or prevaricator. The logical outcome of this tendency is the historical novel with Pythias as the main character and the celebration of Pythias in poetry beginning as far back as Virgil. The process continues into modern times. For example, Pythias is a key theme in Charles Olson's Maximus poems. Details of Pythias' voyage also serve as the backdrop for Chapter 1 of Poul Anderson's science fiction novel, The Boat of a Million Years. The Stone Stories trilogy by Mandy Hogeith, The Walrus Mutterer, 2018, The Ember Seeker, 2019, The Lyre Dancers, 2020, revolve around Pythias of Massalia's journeys. 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 Revolve